Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. My name is Steph.
And I'm Peggy.
And we are broadcasting to you from the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature, which is very, very chilly this week. Very cold indeed.
I'm wearing long johns, but don't tell anyone.
Are you? I would expect nothing less.
Absolutely, it's freezing out there.
It's very, very cold.
It's cold. I wonder if it's cold where everyone else is.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your weather like?
Tell us. Message us in.
Send
Tell
us a postcard.
Are you wearing long johns too? It's very cold, but it's very atmospheric, isn't it?
Yes, Dragon Hall is looking like a peach in the snow, let's
just
say.
Beautiful. She's a good-looking girl, isn't she, our building?
She's a lovely
looking. Head over to our Instagram at Writers Centre to see some lovely snowy photos of our building, Dragon Hall, which is just...
looking so well.
Just beautiful.
Yeah.
But never mind the ice underneath. It's all a bit scary. But Peggy, what have we got in store on today's episode in January?
Well, Steph, today's episode features our good friends, John Osborne and Lewis Buxton. And they are going to be sharing insights on writing poetry for page and for performance, and reflect on their lives as poets living and working in the fine city, in Norwich City of Literature.
I was just telling you, Peggy, that I saw Lewis Buxton himself on Christmas Day in Norwich, which is just,
These poets going about their biz.
He was just, taking a stroll with his lovely, beautiful daughter. And I love Norwich and I love the poets that live within it.
Lovely, lovely.
But before we dive into their conversation, I wanted to give a shout out to our new creative tool that the National Centre for Writing launched this month. So it launched on the 1st of January, and it's called The Writing Life Volume 2. And for those who haven't come across our self-paced challenges before, it is an online self-paced course which gives you a framework for 30 days of creative writing.
So basically you sign up online, and for just 30 quid, you will receive an original writing prompt in your inbox every day for 30 days. As well as insights and advice on how to create a productive writing habit and deepen your skills. And if you miss a day or you need to miss a day, then don't worry. It's a no stress, no deadline course, which you can return to whenever you need inspiration.
So if you've got a New Year's resolution, which was, I want to start writing more, then this is the perfect tool to do that. Lovely. Or if you just fancy doing something a bit different for a month. We think it's absolutely fantastic. We loved the first Writing Life, which is still on sale. It still runs throughout the year. But we now have this volume 2. To find out more, head to nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/the-writing-life-challenge. You'll also find it on the homepage. And you can read details there about both of those existing Writing Life challenges. Bear in mind that you don't have to complete the first one to do the second. They're completely standalone. You can mix and match, do one and not the other, or do both. But if you enjoyed the first and did it with us last year, why not try again with something new?
And now, a little introduction to our writers today. John Osborne is a poet, a scriptwriter, a broadcaster and theatre maker. He began writing whilst studying at the University of East Anglia, and lucky for us, he has never stopped. And he produced an eclectic mix of poetry, storytelling, theatre shows, non-fictional explorations of everything from radio to the charms of the seaside, and even a Sky One sitcom called After Hours. Also, most recently, a piece about mustard for Radio 4, which I heartily recommend on the food programme. His latest collection of poems, To Make People Happy, was published in June 2025.
Lewis Buxton is a writer and theatre maker. His work has appeared in The Independent, Poetry Review, the Rialto, Ambit and Magma, amongst others. He has won the Winchester Poetry Prize, received the UEA Literary Festival Bursary, and is the co-director of Toast. His first collection, Boy in Various Poses, was published by Nine Arches Press in 2021, and we had him on the podcast then to talk about it. And his second collection, Mate Arias, was published in July 2025.
Together, they discuss their poetry collections and their shared themes of happiness, male friendship and connection, touching on everything from Norwich's influence on their writing to how their performances subvert and expand expectations of what poetry is. This is a wide-reaching conversation about finding inspiration, writing the absurd and surreal, and experimenting with form, rhythm, and structure. Let's hand over to Lewis and John.
Hello, John Osborne.
Hello.
So we're going to talk about two things today. Your book, To Make People Happy.
Yeah.
And my book, Mate Arias.
Lovely.
We'll talk a little bit about how they cross over, and then we'll just talk about each other, why we like each other, why we like each other's work.
Why we like ourselves.
Why we like ourselves. I wondered if we should start with a poem each. How do you feel about that?
Can do that.
Yeah? Do you want to start with a poem from Let's Make People Happy?
Yeah, do you know what I will do? I will do a poem called Mowgli. And so this book came out, it was about this time last year, I think. It was November, December 2024. And it took I'd not had a poetry book published for a long, long, long time. And when this very nice man, Hamish, who runs something called Mariscat Press, agreed to put some of my poems out, the first thing I thought was, I finally have a home for this poem that's called Mowgli. And I don't know why it's important for me for this poem to have a home. I don't know why I like it so much. There's definitely other poems in here and that I've written that are much, much better. But for some reason, I just like this poem. I kind of like it as though it's a poem someone else wrote, which is not often how I feel about my stuff. So this is called Mowgli. I once had an affair with a philosophy lecturer, which sounds like the start of a joke, or that I'm about to say something profound about love. But I'm only thinking about it now because Harrogate was just mentioned on the travel news, and we went there once, and it was holding hands, walking by the river when I started to worry we were falling in love, even though that's the only thing I'd ever wanted. My friend once saw Tiger Woods playing crazy golf. And when he couldn't get the ball through that little windmill, he turned to the family waiting patiently behind him and said, "I'm so sorry. I should be able to do this." And they said, "That's okay, Tiger. We're not in any rush. We're on holiday. It's been so long since we just stood making animal noises with our daughters. They are so good at elephant impressions." Someone I work with called her little boy Mowgli because she loves the Jungle Book, and it's a good name, Mowgli. And the Jungle Book is a good title for a book. I bet Rudyard Kipling was happy when he thought of that. My mum played the piano in school assemblies, and I like to picture her in the school hall, stretching her fingers. We didn't have much music in our house, but there was some inside us occasionally. Her favourite Beatle was Paul. That's that.
Maybe before I read a poem, can we talk about this one a bit more?
Yeah.
So this is a thing I think about a lot of your work, but specifically the poems, is your ability to sort of turn corners in a poem. The sort of technical term would be non sequiturs.
Yeah.
That this poem goes from, for like, not sure if you want to fall in love with a philosophy lecturer, to your friend seeing Tiger Woods play crazy golf, to a colleague calling a child Mowgli, to your mum playing piano. It's got like 4 quite distinct sections.
Yeah.
And I have a theory about like what the poem is about generally, but like when writing, is that just like the way your brain moves, like from this thing to this thing to this thing without necessarily sort of causal or sequential links?
Yeah, definitely. And I brought a book with me, which is Actual Air by David Berman, which is my favourite poetry collection by such a long way. He was a poet that I loved so much, and I read him before I'd really written many poems, or just as I was starting to write poems or to take it seriously. And that's what he does. And so I think if I'm ever having a writing afternoon or a writing evening, I'll quite often start it by reading some David Berman. And there's a poem that's called Cantos for James Michener, Part 2. And it is about 8 pages long, 10 pages long. And it is just 3-line stanza followed by 12-line stanza followed by... It's all a mess. It's all chaotic. But every detail is so funny or well observed that it's just really enjoyable. And I occasionally think I'm going to sit down and write and see what happens. So I guess that's the opposite of writing. It's why I don't really enjoy writing to a commission or writing for a very specific reason, because I quite like it to be a mess. And actually, if I was asked to write a poem about Norwich Cathedral to celebrate something, it would have Norwich Cathedral in it, but it would probably go all over the place. So yeah, I do think that's what I do when I'm enjoying writing poems.
I think a lot about James Tate. I don't know if you've come up with like mid-20th century, quite surrealist poet. Wrote a book called The Lost Pilot, and there's a poem in there, can't remember the title of the poem, but it's got a line in it which is just "The sky rumbles with televisions." And it feels like he does, on a sort of sentence level, what you do across a poem, that sense. And it's odd, I've never thought about your work as surreal, but when you take a poem like Mowgli and you see how it's bouncing around, there's a surrealism to it. There's a sort of...
That's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a surreal, not a surrealist, but I loved the absurd. I loved things that didn't make sense. I loved, you're too young to have watched it, but there was a TV show when I was about 10 that was Paul Merton's sketch show. It was on Channel 4, Paul Merton the series. And I would just cry with laughter. I don't often laugh out loud if I'm watching something, but I would cry with laughter. And it was a real mix. And I do think it is the biggest influence I've ever had, because I remember there was one, and I actually misremembered it, but my way, because it's all on Channel 4 OD now, you can watch it again, but he just do these pieces to camera, and he said, this morning I was eating my porridge and a leopard jumped out, and that really ruined my morning. And I think it wasn't the absurdity of the leopard jumping out, it was just the absurdity of him telling this story in a very straight way. And when I started writing performance, I was always desperate, and maybe still am, to be really surreal and really out there, but I'm not brave enough. So it sort of has, I sort of constrained a little bit. But things like, I used to love the Mighty Boosh, and Eddie Izzard's stand-up was one of the huge inspirations as well, and Ross Noble too. And yeah, I love that. I really love it.
Which is all sort of like acknowledged in its own small way in the first two lines. I once had an affair with a philosophy lecturer, which sounds like the start of a joke, or that I'm about to say something profound about love. And those are actually the two things that your poems do quite often. They tell jokes and they say something profound about love.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because if you wanted to like draw some lines across this poem, you could say that there's stuff about failure. There's stuff about, so like, you know, the failure to have an affair with a philosophy lecturer, Tiger Woods' failure. And then that sort of like counterposed with the success, or the supposed success, that you see in Rudyard Kipling, calling it The Jungle Book, which I think is a bad title for a book, actually. And then the idea that we didn't have much music in our house feels like a sort of sadness, maybe not quite a failure. You got that. You got stuff about naming. I like the link between Tiger, Mowgli.
Yeah, I like that.
The children making elephant noises. Even a beetle called Paul.
Yeah,
there's an animal joke in there that sort of runs through. So there is stuff that sort of like holds this whole poem together. It's not random in the way that people who don't know how surrealism would work would say, oh, it's just, you know, just putting one, you know, absurd word in front of another. But The Sky Rumbles with Televisions, for example, actually has quite, I don't know, something about it rumbles through me in the same way this does. I like it a lot. I think it's a lovely poem. On jokes, I'm going to read this poem, which is called Crossword, from Mate Arias. I spent ages trying to get this poem right, and it's folded itself around and around, and it does feel, I think, sometimes like a set of clues. Crossword. With your dead dad, drug problems, chain smoking, panic attacks, and bad temper at parties, not to mention your penchant for puzzles in the pub rather than conversation, the love I bear you is complicated. You left me clues to your interest in our friendship. Can I give you a hand with that? You around for a quick pint after work? I finally got it. I know you've lost arguments and friends because people thought you were a crossword that didn't make sense to them, and you thought they were a waste of your intellect. But with me, you explain clues, rules, the hints in the text, egging me on, saying this one you can get.
Yeah, I love the idea of crossword clues, giving little ideas of people and personalities. And do you do can you do a cryptic?
No, part of the point of part of the autobiography behind this poem, whilst there's a lot in there that I always like the Caroline Bird phrase. She said, all these poems are true, but there are no facts. And so like this poem is true, but all the facts have been changed, you know, dead dads, drug problems, chain smoking. They're true of some people and not of others. But at the heart of it, doing crosswords in the pub, I have friends who are two of my very close friends are very, very good at crosswords, and they do them in the pub. And I am useless at them. I think just because my brain doesn't quite It's not that it doesn't work that way. I'm conscious that there's a logic to it, but there's something about those sort of puzzling genres. Like all my family are mathematicians. Like my brother's a physicist. Both my grandparents were maths teachers. Like they're all very good at maths.
Yeah.
And I'm fine at it. Like, I have a GCSE in it, but like that sort of lateral thinking, is that what it's called? I don't know. The idea of being able to like solve something and think about something in a different way, I'm just kind of crap at. Good at word games, but not cryptic crosswords in that very specific way. Yeah, I just like, but I like it as a metaphor. I like it as, in this case, trying to figure out the men in my life. And they are oftentimes as obfuscating and confusing as crosswords to me. They're cryptic in their own way. They leave you little clues. The idea that men are more demonstrative than they are clear. A lot of people are, but specifically in friendships with men, I've found that you have to sort of unlock these little clues to what they're doing to have any sense of like what they actually mean.
Yeah, like a treasure hunt.
Like a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
There are a lot of poems in this book about pubs, because again, as sites of friendship, of strangeness.
If you were to draw a pie chart of the locations in your poems, not just in this book but in all of the poems that you've written, where would the location with the biggest pie slice be?
Oh, great question. Probably football pitches.
Your football pitches, yeah.
Like, I've got a lot of football pitches. There's some poems in here, so like A Fairy Tale of Shane MacGowan, and then in one of your very early books, Most People Aren't That Happy Anyway, there's a series of haiku for a bar that was in Norwich called Take 5.
Yeah.
That follows a 24-hour cycle.
Yeah.
And it's that's actually, so again, moving on from your like sort of surreal, disjointed poems, you also historically, maybe less in To Make People Happy, but have quite sort of, what I'd say is like sort of quite high concept poems.
Yeah.
Poems that are sort of like, right, here's this idea. So like, you had a poem about George Alagaya practicing for the death of the Queen.
Yeah.
You have a poem in one of these books, which is a poem for Simon Armitage, about hiding Simon Armitage poems around the offices of Anglia windows. So like, when they arrive, that's a different kind of joke, right? And I'm not saying that they necessarily have to be funny, but the construction of a poem in the same way as a construction of a joke, not unlike that line in Crosswords of like, people thought you were a crossword that didn't make sense to them and you thought they were a waste of your intellect. Like, the joke is, why is a man like a crossword? Because people think he doesn't make sense to them and he thinks they're a waste of their intellect, right? It's structured in the same way that a comparative joke is. So I suppose my question is, with those high concept poems that are, again, structured like jokes, but more sort of straightforward joke book jokes, how do you come about those?
I think a lot of those were when I was doing lots of performance. So when I started out, I was lucky because I did my first gig in Norwich in 2006. And that was also the year of the first Latitude Festival and the year that the Birdcage pub opened up that had its own cabaret night. So just by complete luck, by complete chance, I performed for the first time, and then about 6 months later I'd done about 20 gigs just because there was the opportunity to do so, and there was always people saying, I run a night, do you want to do this? And so I was trying to come up with new, and I loved it. I was working at Anglia Windows at the time, which is a very Norwich thing to do, and I didn't have much work to do at my desk, so I was writing poems at my desk. And certainly it's called a day in the life, which is the 3 or 4 lines for each. I don't think they were haiku. I think they were just very, very short, unstructured, an observation for each hour of the day. And it started off as being 9 to 5. I wonder if I can write a bit about 9 a.m. arriving at work, 5 p.m. leaving work. And then it just got bigger and bigger. And that works perfectly for performance, because especially an audience who might not often go to a poetry gig or know anything about poetry, they know about the structure of a day. And I've always loved that kind of structure. I like to write about different days. When I was 18, I wrote a novel that was set. It started on bonfire night and it ended the next bonfire night. And it was just all of the key dates sort of the like Christmas, New Year's Day, Valentine's Day, May Day bank holiday, or FA Cup final. I've always liked that sense of occasion where things are slightly different. And then there's the supermarket poems as well. And I just decided, I wonder what would happen if I wrote a poem for every aisle of the supermarket. So I started with fruit and veg and the tins aisle and then the meat counter. A lot of it is just to have the idea of, I wonder what would happen if I tried this. And says not so much anymore, but I used to have too much free time on my hands. So I have the energy in my 20s and early 30s to go, well, I'm just going to start writing and see what happens. I find that much harder these days.
I think the what if question is one that not a huge amount of poets follow. I think that it's sort of a storyteller and novelist's beginning to a lot of things. But the sort of conceptual what if I wrote a poem for every aisle of the supermarket, or what if I wrote a poem for, in my case, a sonnet for every one of my friends, is it's sort of like a slightly not frowned upon thing now. But there was a moment of like sort of the concept album of poetry collections. So a lot of people were writing, here's a collection of poems where every poem is about a superhero, or here's a collection of poems where every poem is called My Father Died, and etc. Those are random examples. I don't think either of those are actual things that people did, but now I'm sort of inclined to write them both. So yeah, I like that sort of concept heavy thing, especially because it sort of like came after. Do you remember that point in the noughties where like all albums were concept albums? Like, From a Grand Don't Come for Free onwards, and they got steadily worse because it's a difficult thing to do, and unless you're forefronting the storytelling, it's less than ideal.
But and I'd be interested in your view on this as well. But I think quite often that the word poetry is not the most accurate word to describe what I do. We did last week for Norwich Book Festival. We wrote some poems for their family day, and I wrote one of the. I think it might have been the first one I did that day, and it was for a little girl, and she wanted a poem about her cat. And I said, "What other animals do you like?" And she said, "I like leopards and I like tigers." And she liked the big cats. And so I wrote this little poem, and it ended up being quite long. And I read it to her, and she had her face painted as a cat as well. And her mum afterwards, and it was good. But her mum afterwards said, "More like a story than a poem, wasn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, I feel bad to say that that's a poem because it was just a story about this." And I don't mind that, but I've definitely done poetry gigs where people have said to me, that wasn't were they poems? Or were they stories? It's like, I don't care. They're just little bits of writing. But I don't know if you with Mate Arias, you use form a little bit more than I do. You've got rhyming, and you've got, which I don't think there's a single poem in mine that rhymes. And I used to beat myself up about it, or in some of the early ones, there is rhyming, and I stopped myself doing it. Do you find yourself trying to do a structured or particular form, or is that not so important?
No, I think I'm really drawn to writing things in form. I don't really know why. I think part of it comes from a sort of like musical sensibility. Yeah. That like I listen to a lot of music, and I've always loved music. And again, the sort of intersection with performance, that I remember asking the poet Mate Arias once why his poems end on rhyming couplets, and he said, "So the audience know it's done." Right. And I think it's a really good thing when you're performing, if you have that anxiety about like that beat of silence between the end of the poem and the beginning of applause, or the absence of applause. Yeah. Having a very clear, da-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, and poem finished, a clear cadence, what in music you'd call like a perfect cadence, is important. And the sonnet in particular does that, right? It's got a neat little rhyming couplet at the end, even though actually a lot of these poems don't do that. They either don't rhyme, or the rhyme is quite gentle. It's like my favourite final line is in a poem called Lonely Hearts FC, which is about like men trying to find other men to play football with. And the last lines are, "We have just lost a goalkeeper called Kyle, seeking same name replacement, will accept Carl." Yeah. That's one of my favourite half rhymes, Kyle and Carl. that I've ever come up with. So yeah, form is important to me as an organising principle, but again, only in the same way as it's useful when writing stories to follow or to start with a 3-act structure and then sort of spiral off as one feels inclined towards. But again, that basic thing about, is this a poem? I just don't care.
Yeah.
Like, I find it so difficult to get worked up about it. I get much more worked up about my apathy towards it.
Yeah.
And about how often people ask me and they go, well, is Bob Dylan or Kendrick Lamar or Kate Bush, are they poets? I'm like, if they want to be.
Yeah.
Like, it's if you really want to get into it, it's a weird concoction of authorial intention and audience's reception, right? And there are some mad times when whoever has authored the piece of writing says this is a poem, and everybody hearing it or reading it goes, yep, definitely a poem, right? And then there's a bunch of times when that doesn't happen. And yeah, my sort of basic premise for this is, if you call it a poem, it's a poem.
Yeah.
And if you don't want it to be a poem, it doesn't have to be. There's a combination of marketing. So like, I had a conversation with my editor when Mate Arias was coming out, that it says Poems by Lewis Buxton on the front. I said, do we need to say Poems by Lewis Buxton? Can you just say Lewis Buxton? Like, and she made a point. She was like, I just think it's useful for people to know what they're getting in for. And I was like, cool. And I just didn't fight her on it. It's fine by me. I don't really mind. But actually thinking back on it now, I'm like, well, maybe I would have preferred it to say Lewis Buxton so that people can come to it and decide, right? If they want to decide these are small stories, or they want to decide they're things that they're going to sing, or whatever, the audience sort of gets to do that, and I don't have any control over it. And I'm pretty chill about that. But yeah, it just winds me up, because it's also the thing that when you say you're a poet, which I say less and less now, I tend to say I'm a writer.
Yeah.
People want to say, oh, what does this count as poetry? And I'm like, if you think it does.
Yeah.
But they look to you as an authority on it. And again, we can talk about poems being things that have line breaks, but then we all know that poems don't have line breaks. Not all poems have line breaks. We can talk about poems having rhyme, but not all poems have rhyme. We can talk about, as Helen Vendler said, that the poem is the device that directs its mimetic intention towards the sound of the mind in solitary speech. But again, loads of poems don't do that. Helen Vendler was sort of making the point that poems don't all do that. She's actually specifically talking about lyric poetry and how little she likes it. So yeah, that's my sort of like small TED talk on why I don't care if it's a poem. If you call it one and it's useful for you in your understanding of it to call it that, brilliant. But we can dig into it more.
So you asked me about those poems that have that structure and those sort of ideas. When I was reading your collection, the one that I think really stands out, just because it's such a great idea, and it's almost like it could be an entire series, is the Sensitive Men's Club.
Oh yeah.
Partly because that's just such a good idea. So I'm interested in, when you have a good idea for does that title come first and then you put the poem in? And could that poem have been 8 pages long, like one of my David Berman?
Yeah, I think
poems?
that poem actually is. There's a version of it that is much, much longer. So these poems some of them are part of a show that I wrote, which is called Friend, which is about moving to a new city, not having any friends in your early 30s, obsessive compulsive disorder, and the sitcom Friends and Matthew Perry. And so that's actually the poem that sort of closes that. But it definitely began with, wouldn't it be interesting? Actually, what it began with was the name of a WhatsApp group. The name of my WhatsApp group with my 3 close friends is Sensitive Boys Club. And then I was like, wouldn't it be interesting? And I've always been fascinated by the idea of a gentleman's club, because I've never been to one.
Yeah.
It seems like a peculiar idea of people just sort of like arriving with one another and sharing in their erections. So I was like, what would a sensitive gentleman's club look like? And then again, it's sort of just jokes. It's just being like, well, instead of scary bouncers, they'd have labradoodles. Yeah. And also, it's jokes and hopes, I suppose, that like the idea of going into a bar and being like, oh, the toilets aren't horrible, right? And then sort of like delving into the metaphor about being like, well, instead of money, what would you use to pay if it's full of sensitive boys? So it's like bitten nails and completed mental health first aider handbooks. And then there are things about being like, if it's a sonnet, I came across the rhyme handbooks and nan cooks. So the line is completed mental health first aider, handbooks and pale ales that taste like roast dinners your nan cooked. And it's a nice little couplet. Satisfying couplet. So yeah, absolutely. Those, and the same with Lonely Hearts FC. That came with like, wouldn't it be interesting to what would a Lonely Hearts column look like if a man was writing it to find other footballers? Yeah, so I love the idea of starting with a concept and following through on it. So like my first book was called Boy in Various Poses. And so like that, the idea is that like it's a sequence of like portraits of a boy in different positions, different scenarios, and allowing him to be in all those. And I also like that these are poems, but they're referencing other art forms, right? This is called Mate Arias, so they're songs. And going back to your thing about like your biggest influence being like Paul Merton's comedy, whilst I read a lot of poems and I think a lot about like, you know, I've got influences like Mark Doty or Ada Limon or James Tate or Caroline Bird or like loads of different poets. I love like loads of other things that, and like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting? So I think that a lot of my poems are kind of filmic or sitcom-ish because they are a situation and then being like, let's put some people in it and see what we can do. Yeah. We should talk about Norwich. We can talk about Norwich, yeah.
We're in the National Centre for Writing in
But again, I think both of our poems situate themselves oftentimes in Norwich. Yeah. So you wrote a show called Norwich, A Love Story, which very much celebrates the particular way one can come to Norwich and it can feel strange and then it can welcome you in.
An interesting thing about that is when I performed it at the Playhouse, there was a woman on the front row and she was in her late 70s and she'd lived in Norwich all of her life and it was the first time she'd ever been to the Playhouse.
Wow.
And she came and talked to me at the end and she said, I never knew that all of these things that I think about Norwich, it was so strange having someone articulate them and she'd never realised that she'd thought them before. And I thought, well, that's a really good thing that you can sort of say things that you have thought about for a long time and it really resonated with her. And then the next day I got an email from someone who said, I moved to Norwich yesterday, I got off the train and my friend had bought me a ticket for this show that I knew nothing about. So he got off the train at about 6:00, never having been to Norwich before, and then went to see my show. So I quite like that it's and he was like, wow, I've learned so much about Norwich. And I quite like the two of those people being in the same room.
So a lot of my sort of writing practice and the way I approach this, and I think this is particularly relevant to your work, comes from the Alan Bennett play, The History Boys. Yeah. And that makes me think of two very specific bits in it. The first is reflecting what the woman in the front row said, which is teacher Hector says to one of his students about the Thomas Hardy poem, The Young Drummer Hodge. He says, isn't that incredible? That moment in a poem where you find something written down by somebody that you've never met, perhaps somebody long dead, and it's as if somebody is reaching out a hand because they found a thought that you believe to be peculiar to you, and here it is. Yeah. So that's that woman finding all the things that she hadn't even quite put words to, right? And that's the Dylan Thomas thing about like a poem is when an emotion has found its thought and its thought has found its word. That's what that woman is experiencing. And then the person who just moved to Norwich, there's another bit where somebody says, and this isn't necessarily true, but like I think it's the character that was then played by James Corden. They say, oh, we're going to do some poetry, and he slams his head on the table and he looks up and he goes, I don't always understand poetry, sir. And the teacher goes, Timms, I never understand poetry, but learn it now, know it now, and you'll understand it whenever. It might save your life one day. That's what we're doing here, boys. We're making your deathbeds. And that thing about that person being like, look, I'm just going to come along to this thing, and I won't necessarily get it all, but I'll learn a little bit, and they will take it forward, right? They'll remember, that particular bit in the hotel when she's learning to be a receptionist in Norwich, A Love Story. Yeah. And then be like, and then when they start a new job, they'll remember that little bit. I only ever get that with really depressing bits of my poems. So like I had a poem in my first book which ends, "What a time to be a boy under the age of 45, what a time not to be a machine, what a time to not quite be alive." And someone came out to me and was like, "Oh, like I lost my brother recently to like he died by suicide," and that line is exactly how I feel right now. And that's an incredible thing to hear, but it goes back to like I don't want to take anything away from the impact of that line or the impact that had on a person. But again, I'm writing those like jokes.
Yeah.
Like I'm like it's a pun on what a time to be alive, right? What a time to not quite be alive. And I suppose that's the power of it, that it sounds funny and then you actually think about it and you're like, oh, that's not funny at all. Which is, again, my prevailing experience of work is that I go downstairs from my office and say to my wife, oh, I wrote this really funny poem. And she reads it and she goes, that's devastatingly sad.
Yeah.
Or I come downstairs and I'm like, oh, I've written this thing. It's quite sad. It's quite raw and emotional. And she reads it and she goes, that's very funny. And but I think that's true of you. That like, I think to make people happy, we will get back to Norwich in a minute, but like, I think this is one of your saddest books. It gets happier. Like there are bits, you know.
But yeah, there's some really bleak stuff in there.
Toward the end. But like, Jesus, out of a lump of clay, I've been telling babies their manuscripts will be turned down without the first line being read is the first line. The one about a physics teacher dying.
Yeah, there's a lot of death. There's one that I felt really proud of, but I do think it, and I've only ever read it out once, but that's called I Would Love to Die in My Own House.
It's such a good poem.
And I read it out at an event and I just thought, yeah, that might have been not quite what people were coming out for this evening.
But again, that's so the thing about like when you work in poems and performance and a certain expectation that you're like, I should probably make the audience laugh at least once.
Yeah.
Mainly because, again, it comes back to that thing about like what is poetry. And I think both of us really enjoy subverting people's expectations of what poetry is.
Definitely.
And if you go on stage and you make a joke and people laugh, given that they were like braced for poems, and then you sort of, do that thing that you do where you'll be like telling a story and then suddenly there's a poem happening.
Yeah.
Or whatever we decide as a poem in that particular moment. That's deeply satisfying for us. But I think it shouldn't hold you back from reading poems like I'd Love to Die in My Own Home, because it's still funny. It's really moving. And it's really, I just love how countercultural is the wrong word. I really feel like you push against what people expect. You push against cliche.
Yeah.
So much. Like, everyone's saying like, oh, I don't want a long, you know, I think we're both sort of at the point where like we have older parents. My father is obsessed with dying, and to the extent that a couple of years ago for Christmas he gave us his last will and testament. He volunteers in a local cemetery. Like, he spends a lot of time thinking about the dead, and repeats to me quite often like, oh, I don't want it to be a long drawn out thing. I just want to go. And the whole sort of like, you know, it's better to burn out than fade away, or whatever the Kurt Cobain thing is, right? Yeah. This is the exact opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite of like shotguns and attics. It's, I just want to gently, quietly.
But I think there's something really important in that poem, which is I just want things to be how they used to be. For most people, that's how they are now. I think there's something really interesting about, and I used to get really upset by people who, in jobs where I've had, whether like, I used to work in a hotel and I used to work as a support worker. Especially when I was a support worker, actually, there was someone else I worked with and go, oh, it's a really boring day today, isn't it? And you think, well, our job is going well if it is a boring day, because if it's not a boring day, it's because there's been an emergency or something we've had to deal with. So we should be like really rejoicing, and this is a boring day where we can put a bit of telly on, go for a little walk, cook some carbonara. Anything like that is a really, like, why are you complaining that it's a boring day? And suddenly when it's not a boring day, when something bad and something horrible is happening, you would give anything for a day when you just sort of
the way things used to be.
Flick through the channels the way things used to be.
Yeah, but you like, see, this is to do with your specific sense of occasion, and like that thing you were saying about like you enjoying occasions, like you like, but you don't just like, you like small occasions.
Yeah.
You like the small occasion of going for a drink. You like the small occasion of watching the news, right? We met for a drink the other day, and you were absolutely thrilled that you'd walked to work that day.
Yeah, I was, yeah.
And, like, there's this sort of wonderful joy in that. Do you, like, given that we're talking about, like, slightly depressing poems, do you consider yourself an optimist?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I think I'd be silly not to. So in my writing, I think I probably do. I don't think I'm an optimist particularly. I'm certainly not a pessimist.
No.
But yeah, in my writing, I think you'd probably, if you were to write a press release about if my collected works came out, I think you would probably use the word optimism, optimistic, like that. I think those words, that area is described or attributed to me. So yeah, but it depends how you want to interpret a poem about those poems. Like, because there's actually another poem about dying, about being a support worker and the person who I supported dying when I arrived on a Sunday morning and he died. And that's why I had to stop being a support worker, because I was sort of made not only had he died, it's like, well, it was my job to come and support you. And that revenue suddenly disappeared. And that part of my life just overnight, it's like, well, I can't. That was such a odd thing to experience, and I promised myself I would never write a poem about it. I don't like to. It's one of the notes that I made to ask you about as well. Actually, I don't really like to write about true things often. I like to have sorts of vague allusions to the truth, but completely invent things. But this poem, this collection, To Make People Happy, there's a lot of really, really true things, and including that thing, which is, in a way, one of the 2 or 3 most sort of horrific things to have ever happened to me. But I don't mind, maybe because there's some love and warmth and humour in that poem. I'm quite happy to do that on stage.
Yeah.
With I'd Love to Die in My Own House, there's not a single funny line or observation. It's just bleak. But so you've had a baby recently, is that something you write about? Is that, like, do you write about your parents in a very honest way? Or
yeah, I think that, well, again, I go back to the Caroline Bird, Not All Things, This Is All True, but there are no facts. I also love the Sharon Olds thing. She was asked, are these personal poems? And she said they're apparently personal. And I think that I think there's a certain amount of respect one has to give to the real people in one's life who might be affected by the poems that you're writing. So, like, I think Colm Toybeen says you can't care about your aunts. Like, don't care about who you're going to be offending by, borrowing that thing that they do for your novel. I don't quite truck with that. Like, and I'll often, if I'm writing a poem about someone, maybe not quite run it by them, but like, tell them that I've done it. Like, this is not quite the same thing, but like, I have a poem coming out in a magazine in the next couple of weeks, and they get you to write a little note about why you've written it, and the poem's called Touch Me Up in the Garden, and it's about being like in your 30s, having been, with the same person for 10 years, married, and still thinking they're fucking smoking hot, and imagining that you're like back at a house party in 2004, and yet touching each other up in the garden. But there's in the little bit that I said about like why I wrote it, I said something along the lines of like, this is a poem this poem is an exercise in failure, not only in the sort of content mirroring form that it's about the failure of horny teenagers at parties in 2007, but also that it's failure because I think it's a poem that tries to be as good as Ella Frears' poem Fucking in Cornwall. Like, I wanted to grasp at the same sort of sexy nostalgia that she achieves in that, and I don't think I succeed. I just don't think it's as good as that poem. But like, I wrote that, and then I text Ella Frears and I said, just so you know, I've written this thing, and it's about how good your poem is. But that's a really easy thing, because it's just saying like, whereas like, if you're writing about like a weird thing that my uncle said 10 years ago, it's also a question of proximity. Like, how close am I to that person? How likely do I think it is that they'll actually read it? I think with Mate Arias, I happened upon there's a lot of stuff that is sort of obfuscated. There's stuff that's very clear who it's about. So like bird watching is very clearly about my friend Will. But then there's a poem called Obituary, which is about, it could be about several different people. There are certain, so like one of the reviews of this said something about like he's cleverly hidden his friends with pseudonyms. It's all their real names. Like cinema with Alex, watching films with Tom, arguing with Matt. Like that's absolutely, those are their real names. I am lucky that I'm of that particular generation where I have several friends called Alex and several friends called Tom and several friends called Matt. So they can, but like, there's probably only one Matt who I've gone to the seaside with and got chips where our wives thought we were stupid for jumping in the sea. But like, yeah, so I in answer to your question, yes, I think about it. No, I don't get hugely hung up on the truth of it.
Would you feel a bit disconnected from that collection if you'd changed the names to completely random names?
So it depends on when I'm reading them, right? Because there actually is one name change in there. And it's a poem called Conversations with Friends, where I talk Rosa only drinks JD and full fat Coke. The person in my life who drinks JD and full fat Coke is not called Rosa. Yeah. But actually, this is sort of like going in, both of us write stories and write shows where, for narrative purposes, you have to create composite characters and you have to make people do things that they don't actually do, right? Because it's that Ronald Tobias thing. He wrote a book called 20 Master Plots, and he says that in life people will accept randomness. In fiction they won't, right? And I think that sort of goes for any sort of construction of art. Like, people won't accept randomness in it. It's why I hate the ending to that David Nicholls book One Day, because it's a totally random thing that happens, and I think it leaves you deeply unsatisfied
I agree.
When someone just dies or someone just flies away. Right? It's the equivalent of it was all just a dream. Poems, you can get away with it a little bit more. You can allow for, like, you know, because it's not following a story structure. But yeah, I like a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of fiction.
I think detective shows as well. It was definitely, I think it might have been Jonathan Creek, an episode of Jonathan Creek where the reveal at the end was something that no person watching it would ever, it was like information that we didn't have.
Yeah.
And it was so...
Oh, but what you didn't know...
Such an anticlimax.
Was that actually he went to Scotland in 1942.
Because I think it was some... Exactly. And I think it was something like a special New Year's Day or Christmas Eve episode. So it was like in the era of people sort of going, oh, there's a new
great, there's a New Year's Eve fest.
And I think that's a really important thing to remember of... I've written a few theatre shows and most of them are exaggerations and one... told as a true story, but you've embellished your own bits. And people often say afterwards, is it a true story? And it always really annoys me and upsets me.
Yeah, it really irritates me, Is that true?
Like,
why does it matter?
You don't actually want the answers to this, because my answer would be, oh no, you know that character I just made, and because they'd walk away.
But it's magic tricks, right?
Yeah.
Like, people don't want to know how the magic trick works, right? Because they either... The two potential answers to a magic trick is, here's a really complicated thing. So, like, to do this card trick, I'm doing this really complicated thing where I've got, like, I'm holding it in a particular way in my hand and I've practiced this over and over and over and over again, so it's really hard to do. And someone goes, oh, well, that's really like, there's like mechanisms and wires and stuff, I just didn't see them. Or it's something really simple and they go, oh, you just flick your hand like that, anyone could do it.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, well, if anyone can do it, it's not special.
Yeah.
Right? And that's when somebody's asking when they say, is it true? Because if it's true, they're like, well, anyone could do it.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, I suppose that's not as interesting as I thought it was. And if it's not true, then unless they're deeply interested in craft, which most people aren't, they're going to be like, oh. So what people don't realise is that the joy is either in just accepting the story and allowing all of those moments to affect you in whatever way that they affect you, or it's in the mystery.
Yeah.
They're like, no, it's okay if you don't know if that's completely true. I don't know, but people want that tagline. They want the based on a true story, and they feel cheated when it's not.
Yeah.
I'm aware we're sort of like coming to the end of our timing. So I wanted to end because we've sort of touched on this throughout, but it's one
Do you
of my
want to talk
favourite.
about Jonathan Creek some more?
Well, no, sort of. No, I wanted to ask about what are the fun things that you watch or read or listen to that put you in a frame of mind for writing?
I've got two definites. I think I've got three definites that it is David Berman poems.
Great.
Changed my life completely.
Well, I've never read them, so I'm now really excited to read them.
I will lend you my copy
Great.
as long as you give it back. And if you don't give it back, I'll break into your house
You
and
know where I
leave
live.
it back. Another, so I very, very occasionally, not so much anymore, but very occasionally in the past, I've been asked if I had any advice for writers.
Yeah.
And I think that if you want to have an evening, so I love having a whole evening to myself writing, is what I did last night. And it's quite rare. I like to cook nice food, put some nice music on, and have the whole evening uninterrupted. So no phone, nothing like that, just writing. Norwich, a Love Story, I wrote in 2 evenings in a travel lodge. And I got the whole thing, and it was all music. And it's nearly always Bob Dylan.
Wow, cool.
And it's nearly always red wine. So they're my two things that, like red wine, Bob Dylan. If I've got my David Berman book with me, which I probably will do if I know I'm going to go away writing, then that would be it as well. I don't think there's any kind of media or TV or radio or anything that particularly influences my writing. I feel like those are two very separate things. Like I watch TV, and that, I think this is something you have to train yourself to get good at. I used to have a friend who was a poet, and you go and watch football with him, and he was trying to watch football as a poet.
Yeah.
It's like,
I've tried to do that.
Yeah, and it's like just watch the football.
Yeah.
And then if you want to write a poem about the football, you can. But watch the football as listen to music as a person,
Human being.
as a human being. Yeah. So no, I don't think there's anything. So my advice would have always been to people: just choose some things that you really, really love and allow yourself to spend some time with them.
Yeah.
I don't think that's quite an answer to the question that you asked, but
No, it is.
But
Bob Dylan.
yeah,
That's
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. But also you've talked about like Paul Merton, Izzard,
Yeah,
Mighty Boosh, like that sort of stuff. I think that I am very similar, but in an entirely different way. So like I have to have mornings, or days, right? But sometimes days can be intimidating. It's too long, especially if you're writing poems.
Yeah.
It's not a fucking thing. But I like to create a sort of like pressure around myself. So I like to sort of not allow myself to write for as long as I can, and just listen to things, read things, watch things, and sort of like allow without, getting sucked into the vortex of YouTube or Instagram, allow myself to just sort of like flounder in those things. So at the moment I'm really into like horror novels. So I just finished reading The Exorcist, which is amazing. It's an incredibly well written book. And just allowing myself to think and think, sometimes make a note, but basically allow it all to build up, and then it's a matter of timing of getting it just right. But I also like doing stuff like going for walks or runs or to the gym where I cannot write anything down.
Yeah.
Because I obsessively write things down because I'm always worried about forgetting things. But yeah, so my things at the moment are watching horror films, reading horror or gothic books, and then trying to engage with things that are nothing to do with what I want to write or think about, and like reading, so prior to that, and also like reading loads of poems or listening to poetry podcasts or anything like that, and like immersing myself in it, and then also listening to The Guardian Football Weekly.
Yeah.
I'm not going to write a poem about The Guardian Football Weekly, right? But sort of distracting my mind a bit, and then in that moment of relaxation, which I suppose is the version of red wine and Bob Dylan, your mind pops something up.
Yeah.
I think that probably brings us quite neatly to the end. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Way. Both Make People Happy and Mate Arias are available online and in good bookshops. Thank you so much, John Osborne.
A big thank you to Lewis Buxton and to John Osborne for their time. We love you both. And if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us, you don't just have to tell us about what the weather's like near you. Tell us about what you read over Christmas. Tell us anything. You can find us at Writers Centre on Instagram and Blue Sky. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation on the website by going to the Support Us page.
And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a 5-star rating and a review, because this helps other writers and listeners to find us.
Thanks again. Keep writing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.